Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this webinar session. I'm Tony Schönenberger. I'm the Executive Chairman of STARS. STARS is a global platform for dialogue to discuss developments which will impact our society as a whole, but particularly also our businesses in the next couple of years. Today we are continuing our webinar series called "Is this the final end of Pax Americana? Implications for business and society?" No doubt, we are facing a multitude of disrupting phenomena, particularly in the area of geopolitics and geoeconomics. And no doubt, developments in the US are key for the world as a whole. Thus, we are planning 4 webinars on this topic. Today, we have the great privilege to talk to Kevin Kajwara. Kevin, thank you very much for joining this session. Kevin is co-president of Political Risk Advisory at Teneo, New York. In this capacity, Kevin advises Fortune 100 CEOs and institutional investors with insights on geopolitical and policy risks and their investment and corporate strategy implications. Kevin, we are very much looking forward to your insights. I want to introduce you now to our moderator, Mark DITTLI. Mark is a leading financial journalist and founding partner of The Market here in Zurich, the leading digital business and finance platform here in Switzerland. Mark, thank you very much once again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tony, and a warm welcome from my side as well from Zurich today. Kevin, it's a pleasure to have you on the program, and we'll talk about the end, if it's the end of Pax Americana and America's standing in the world. Obviously, for you in the audience, I would like to invite you to join the discussion. So whenever you have a question during our conversation, just type it in with the Q&A button, and I will keep an eye on all the questions that are in the room, and I will do my best to weave them into our conversation where it's appropriate. So again, at any time, when you have a question or a remark or a comment, just type it in. Now, Kevin, obviously, the topic of the discussion is the final end of Pax Americana and what it means for business and society. I'd like to start really with the question, I'm looking back over the last several decades. The United States was the guardian of a rules-based liberal world order, an order that has come to be known as Pax Americana. Is that order over? Can it be said that Pax Americana is over?
Well, first of all, thank you, Mark, and thank you, Tony, for having me on today, and good day, everyone, wherever you may be. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Look, I think that something is definitely going on, and what exactly that means is, I think, remains unclear. What we have definitely sort of shifted into, right? I mean, you're talking about Pax Americana as this era since the end of World War II, but then even more recently, since the end of the Soviet Union, really, we've been in this kind of unipolar world that has been characterized then by this kind of by a couple of things, right? The sort of the biggest expansion of democracy in history, but also the ever increasing position of China in the world and what that was going to mean. And now we're in this kind of moment of flux, which I think would be best characterized by sort of a return of great power rivalry. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's where we're going to wind up. But I think that from a business perspective, there's something to really consider here, right? Which is that, as you just laid out, Mark, you talked about this liberal, rules-based international order, of which the United States was ostensibly, essentially the CEO. And this was characterized by a lot of things, right? For business people, if you took advantage of the guidelines that were laid out in that system that was designed by the US and its allies coming out of the war, right, with all of the institutions that they designed that kind of shaped the world, everything from the institutions coming out of Bretton Woods, like the IMF and the World Bank, the United Nations, the Security Council, the non-proliferation regime, the precursors to the WTO, all of those types of things. It created this environment where if you took advantage of what that provided, labor rate differentials, free flow of capital and open markets, being able to go to absolute lowest cost supply chains and the like. If you got that combination right, you were going to be one of the winners. But the other externality of that then was that created an environment where the multinational corporation became the single most important economic actor. In a world where the U.S. no longer wants to play that role, perhaps, right? Then that changes things for the corporate world, right? And whether this kind of linear progression of the total addressable market may start to change if all of a sudden you're in a sensitive industry and China is suddenly just a closed off market to you in some way, right? And then obviously there's a lot of other variables as well. On the other hand, one other element of this period that you're referred to as Pax Americana, of course, has been just that, the Pax. I mean, for all the horrible wars that we've had since World War II, this era has been characterized by a lack of war between the great powers, right? Between the largest economies in the world, which is a historical anomaly for this period of time, for this length of time. And in fact, probably the fewest people by percentage of the human population have died as a result of war during this era. And that has allowed for all kinds of things like, the empowerment of women, more children surviving, childhood, greater access to healthcare and education, all of these things which brought a bigger percentage of the global population into the global economy, had a lot of positive externalities. In the nuclear age, though, the end, quote unquote, of Pax Americana doesn't necessarily mean a return to great power war. Obviously, there is that risk between the United States and China, certainly between the United States and Russia and others. But in a world where mutually assured destruction remains an issue, that remains an unimaginable way to adjudicate differences. So there's going to be, it's unclear exactly where we're going to wind up. It could be in this constant sort of tension for the next several decades. But that will have, implications both on global growth, as well as inflation.
You said the world order is changing. It's in flux. We don't quite know yet where it will settle. Now, this current situation has been termed as a new multipolar world order. We've heard the term a second Cold War or Cold War 2.0. What, in your view, is the most apt, the most precise characterization of where we're at now?
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't say a new world order as yet, because it remains in flux. There's a lot of debate in academic circles and foreign policy circles about whether it's appropriate or not to refer to this as a Cold War between the United States and China. I certainly don't think that, to some degree, I think that is an argument for academic circles in a way. I mean, it's kind of, if both sides are acting like it's a Cold War, essentially, it kind of is one to a certain degree. But what I would say is that there are a lot of emerging powers in what is sort of pejoratively sometimes referred to as the global South. Whether we're talking about Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, large markets, certainly India. But I think if you're the United States or if you are China, you don't regard any of those as really significant powers, either as individuals or others. I mean, clearly, a lot of those countries are trying to hedge their bets, are trying to play both sides to get the best possible deal. They're having some success in that to a certain degree. But this is a moment of sort of vulnerability in both the United States and China, which is allowing them to do that to a certain degree. But if you think about it, really, at the end of the day, power is a function of three major variables. One is raw military or hard power, economic power, and then soft power. And I think that combination is really still only found in the United States. European Union clearly has economic power and massive soft power, but relatively little hard power. China's got hard power and economic power, but relatively little, relatively little soft power. So it's again, I think it's premature to say that we've arrived at the new world order at this point. And that's, and this is what I think is so complicating for business leaders today, right? As I kind of laid out the foundational elements of globalization, or the elements of Pax Americana, if you were a CEO or a board member or someone in the C-suite for all of these years, I mean, you essentially had to try to get that combination right. And if you improved on that from the management that you inherited the company from, and you improved on that to hand off a better company to the next generation of management, your company was likely to do pretty well. In today's world, the CEO is encountering something that they didn't rise up through the ranks anticipating, number one. And number two, it's sort of the building the proverbial plane while you're flying it kind of a moment. And that's why it's fraught with so much risk.
On that topic of globalization, or looking back where we had years after years where trade barriers went down, free trade was on the rise, we have come to a world today where protectionism is on the rise again, industrial policy is on the rise again, and the United States is a leading actor in erecting trade barriers again and engaging in trade conflict. Is that something that will be with us for years and even decades to come?
I mean, and I know we're going to get to talk about this soon, but in the United States right now, there is absolutely no appetite on either Republican or Democratic side to pursue significant new trade deals. If anything, as you say, they are both talking about erecting further barriers, and that's not, then that's having repercussions. We're seeing that in Europe with China right now, and in other places as well. And I think one of the things that we have got to consider, at least over the next couple of years, we can see every single day that just this morning we had a pretty benign inflation print in the United States, which is good news. And now of course the market fully starts to build in anticipation of when the rate cuts will begin by the Fed and so on and so forth. But the reality of it is that there's been a remarkable job done by the central banks of bringing down that sort of pandemic-induced inflationary spike. But it's always very devilish to get to that final mile, right? To get inflation from 3% down to 2% is very, very challenging. And part of that isn't just a monetary policy phenomenon, right? This is also part of, we have to think as economic relations between the US and say Europe and China become more fraught. China has itself played over the last, since they entered into the WTO. I mean, they have spent the better part of the last 20, 30, 40 years being, keeping inflation down by producing so many cheap goods. Being the largest producer of stuff, the United States is the largest consumer of stuff. All of a sudden, that's going to come into, a clash. So yeah, I mean, I think, and then there's the second part of this. Before I get to the industrial policy point, one of the other things that followed after the pandemic, both from a supply chain resiliency perspective, because the Chinese market effectively became closed off, as well as the national security element that's arisen, is this kind of concept of remixing the global supply chain. It's very, I mean, if you think about it, the supply chain centered on China has been extremely elegantly constructed, and it took a very, very long time and generations of managements on both the Chinese side and in their trading partners' side to build over the years. And now all of a sudden we're saying, hey, in a very short period of time, we need to completely reorient that in a way. That is not easy to do. Very few markets provide the scale that China does, the infrastructure, the entire ecosystem built around their manufacturing system. So when you look at places like Vietnam and Hungary and northern Mexico and other potential manufacturing sites, they don't have a lot of those components, and certainly haven't had the attention from managements of companies around the world to build that ecosystem like that. So we're entering into a world where, you know, there are a whole host of completely reasonable rationales for, you know, diversifying supply chain, building in more redundancies and resiliency and all of the other things. But lowest cost is now no longer the primary driver of that. And so, you know, that's going to have longer term ramifications as well. Now, on the industrial policy side, for many, many years, industrial policy was a bad word, or bad two words in the US economy in particular. Though our history of it has been, you know, there have been times in, you know, the quote unquote military industrial complex, the space program, you know, other things where US industrial policy had been quite strong in terms of delivering us to the next level of our economy. It's going to take some years to see the IRA, the Chips and Science Act, and the infrastructure bill kind of play out in the U.S. and all that means for the green transition, both in the U.S. and in Europe and in other markets as well. But I do think that, you know, we've seen some phenomenal examples of this working. Probably the single best example was the Trump administration's Operation Warp Speed with the development of the mRNA vaccines, and how fast that happened. The U.S. government did not pick winners, but it protected the downside of those two, you know, and so created an environment where the best product could come to market. Similarly, as we look at the space race right now, which obviously is becoming more and more heated, not just between the U.S. and China, but Japan, India, Europe, all, you know, all with major commercial attempts in space. You know, the creation of SpaceX and Blue Origin and others bringing commercial, you know, bringing commercial elements to the space program is bringing down costs and bringing up optionality to the space agencies.
Now, in terms of America's standing in the world, obviously, in a little less than 4 months, we'll have the presidential elections in the US. I was just in Singapore a couple of weeks ago, and whenever I talk to people in the area, they looked, and the same goes for Europeans as well, they look at this election with a mix of worry and puzzlement. We have a very old acting sitting president, and we have a contender who was in the White House already, who is a convicted criminal. So what do you make of this presidential election, and how do you see America's image and standing in the world being affected by this election?
Well, let me just caveat everything I'm about to say here by saying that I think when it comes to the U.S. election in 2024, the world can kind of be divided into two types of people here. One is the people who know that they don't know how this is going to turn out, and those who don't know that they don't know how it's going to turn out. And so we're very much in the speculative realm here, because we're in kind of an unprecedented situation, right? It's very rare that a president who has been in office runs again. And as you say, we have the unprecedented nature of a president who has been convicted of crimes, has been, you know, is facing further charges, facing potentially even jail time, et cetera. So it's an unusual situation. And in addition, you know, because of the peculiarities and the idiosyncrasies of the election system in the United States and the Electoral College, you know, the reality of it is, considering the importance of the United States, that a couple of 100,000 people in about 5 states are going to determine, you know, the direction of the world takes for 8 billion people. And it really, you know, when you put it in those stark terms, it kind of brings it all home. I do want to make one comment, though, and that is, if you look at a lot of academic measurements of democracy, right? I mean, you talked about the sort of the improvement and the widening democratic movement in the post-war era, and I think, you know, if you look at those indices, sort of the all-time high of democracy was around 2012, 2013, something like that. We have retreated from that, to be sure, but back to about 2002 levels or something. It's not like we've gone back to the 1930s or something of that nature yet. So I don't want to be too much of a doomsayer here, but the bigger point, though, Mark, I think, is that the United States is asking itself what role it wants to play in the world going forward. And this is bigger than both Trump and Biden, right? Trump in some ways is the poster child for this. But it's a question that has been, increasingly asked by the American citizenry, particularly after the global financial crisis, which really put into kind of stark contrast the winners and losers, the haves and have-nots, greater inequality in the country, and people asking, well, I can see the quote unquote coastal elites winning from globalization and all of that, but what is it doing for me? And this kind of social compact of, I am going to do better than my parents did, and my kids will do better than me, that had basically been the hallmark of the middle class, is something that's increasingly called into question, not just in the United States, and actually not just in Europe. Actually, interestingly, inequalities at basically at all-time highs again in China as well. And so it's a phenomenon that is bigger than the United States, to be sure, but it's something that's really being acutely felt here right now. And again, going back to what I was saying earlier, for the corporate leaders, right, this question of, is the U.S. going to continue to be the guarantor of that international rules-based order, or not? And the alternative to the international rules-based order is not just that the U.S. say retires as the global CEO, if you will, and then all of a sudden, say, China or something takes over. China has a fundamentally different view of how the global operating environment ought to look, what the rules ought to be, and the like. And we have to consider too that I think that the data is still out, the jury is still out to a certain degree on whether we've hit peak China or not. But we're at a moment of economic vulnerability, and therefore some degree of political vulnerability in China, and its ability to impose its will. But nonetheless, world history has been democracy is a short-term anomaly. It's not the natural order of things. It's extremely delicate. We are seeing that in parts of Europe play out just in this election cycle, in the US in this election cycle. It's a very, very delicate thing that requires the active participation of the population, but the alternative to that is what's called the jungle. It's like your garden, right? When you don't tend to it, the jungle will grow back. Strongman rule, in other words. And that's kind of what we're seeing right now with the U.S., the U.S. sphere, the China sphere, and then some other attempts with things like Russia in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and everybody trying to kind of figure out how to play one country off against another.
Now, when you say that, basically Americans are asking themselves what role America should play in the world. Now, one alternative is obviously an inward turn, basically turning its back to the rest of the world and an inward turn. The last time America did that was about 100 years ago, after World War I. And that, let's call it that multipolar moment 100 years ago did not end well at all for the world. What are your thoughts on how that could play out?
Yeah, so this is a really big concern, Mark, right? Is that you're quite right. There have been other moments when the U.S. has either turned inwardly, gotten extremely polarized. Obviously the most profound manifestation of that was in the period leading into the Civil War in the U.S. but even as recently as like the 1960s, we've had that here. The problem is, how do you get everybody to the other side? How do you get your population to everybody sort of be on the same page and row in the same direction? It usually requires a common enemy of some sort. And unfortunately, when you look at history, it has required a paroxysm of violence, usually, either externally in a war like World War II, or we've had, internal issues like we did in 1968, mass protests, assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, things of that nature. And that's a daunting thing to consider. But it's also one it's hard to see, considering, again, like I said earlier, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq certainly weren't enough to do that, and they obviously left Americans divided, and much of the rest of the world's esteem for the U.S. Lower after those conflicts. But I guess my point would be that in a world where a war that could lead to a nuclear exchange is kind of unthinkable, and also no longer needs to be. Wars don't, notwithstanding what we're seeing in Russia and Ukraine as an example, but most wars today can rely on the volunteer armies of countries like the U.S., right? There's no call up of masses of troops anymore because of the high tech nature of war. It's not a collective experience for everybody the way that that wars were in the past. So it's very unclear to me exactly what will happen. But I think if you think about the biggest issues that have hit the United States over the last, over the course of this century, 9/11, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the global financial crisis, the pandemic, none of these things were enough. In fact, all of them led to further polarization in the society rather than getting back off the same page.
Let's assume for a moment that Donald Trump wins in November. Many people remember his first term as him being not very nice to America's allies in the world, be it the NATO partners in Europe and also America's allies in Asia, East Asia. What will a hypothetical Trump 2.0 administration look like, and how will it behave towards other countries in the world?
Well, Mark, I would encourage your audience to go back and read. It's a couple of months old now, but Donald Trump gave an interview to Time magazine. Don't go read the article. Well, you should read the article, but really read the transcript of the interview, the word-for-word transcript of the interview, because he lays out what his vision of the world is and how he thinks America ought to participate. And I think that, again, it is one of it's one of a much more inward turn, right? A much more much more transactional in nature. It raises serious question marks about what the Allied system even means. NATO is convened in Washington for the 75th anniversary over the last couple of days. I don't think that the assembled crew is feeling particularly great about that. If anything, they're trying to, quote unquote, Trump-proof NATO from that. And when you look at the Indo-Pacific as an example, countries like that are so critical to America, there, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the like, and increasingly India, they all live in that neighborhood. If the United States pulls back, they will still be there. So immediately after this kind of unprecedented trilateral summit between the United States, Japan, and South Korea met with China, right? Modi of India and Putin have just met. This is, it goes back to what we've been talking about how the world order is getting kind of shaken up, and countries have to hedge. Because they've got their own sort of interests to pursue. The other thing I would just say about the Trump administration, a potential second Trump administration, just from a purely kind of logistical perspective, a lot of the people who were considered the sort of institutionalist or adults in the room, quote unquote, in that first administration are not going to be there this time around. It's more the kind of true believers, right? Secondly, former President Trump himself, who admitted that when he entered office, he kind of, wasn't really expecting to win back in 2016. So that first year or two, he was trying to figure out the levers of power in Washington. He obviously goes back a much more experienced guy if he wins. And, there are some 3,000-4,000 positions in an administration that require Senate approval. It took them a long time to get people into all of those positions. They are ready to go. Those lists are ready to go on day one. And if as looks likely, the Republicans take control of the Senate, they'll be able to get those approved quite quickly. So I would think he would be up and running more quickly. It's going to be more ideologically focused. And yet still subject to the sort of the whims of a pretty transactional, and he himself a not particularly ideological guy. So my point is, I think it will be again, it will be hard, and a lot of what he's going to do, because if the Democrats take control of the House, which also I think looks likely, you're going to have split Congress. So a lot will be done via executive order, which for companies, again, it doesn't give you long-term visibility of what policy is going to, and the regulatory environment is going to look like. These things can just be undone. I would imagine that Donald Trump will get out of the Paris Climate Agreement again on day one of his next administration. He will issue more oil and gas permits as an example. Some of these things are going to be sort of day one type actions. Will
he also pull out of NATO?
He will not pull out of NATO, I don't think. I think that there's that would require congressional acquiescence, but you don't have to formally pull out. I think rhetorically you can do a lot of damage. You can pull troops out. You can, you can essentially, emasculate the operation in a lot of ways, and even just by calling into question, because at the end of the day, a treaty and and Article 5 in particular in this case is only it's a piece of paper that somebody signed, and you're only kind of as good as your word in a sense. When Trump makes a comment that he would invite Russia to do whatever the hell it wants to countries in Europe that haven't fulfilled their obligations on defense, which, by the way, there are no obligations set in the NATO treaties, as an example. But nonetheless, that question alone is damaging and weakens the alliance.
Kevin, time is running. We have to come to a close, but allow me a last question on the elections. Give us your best guess or your best estimate right now. Who will be the two candidates and who will win?
So again, this is a very difficult thing to say because we're in kind of uncharted territory at the moment. I think it's quite clear that Donald Trump will be the candidate for the Republicans. We are clearly going through a moment where on the Democratic side, it is unclear to me whether President Biden is going to, survive as the nominee and candidate for the Democratic Party. I think we're going to have to see what happens over the next week or so. And this is we're starting to see the Democratic wall break, and you're having more elected officials actually either call for him to step aside or be open to the possibility that something may change. And also on the big money front, the actor George Clooney, who is a big money raiser for the Democratic Party and for President Biden historically, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times today calling for him to step aside. So it hasn't become a flood as yet, and I think that there were certainly some who were holding back while world leaders were in Washington for the NATO summit. Attention is going to shift back to President Trump, former President Trump next week, because the Republican convention is going to start. But between now and the Democratic convention, we're going to have to see what happens. clearly, one of the reasons why President Trump has gotten kind of quiet since the debate is that after spending years and months trying to destabilize Biden, since the American population and electorate cannot unsee what they saw that night at the debate, now I think Trump's strategy is to try to keep Biden in the race. The thing that would be most unsettling to them would be to change that race, change the dynamic of the race completely. So we'll have to see. If the election were held today, in likelihood, Trump wins. But I am, I carry a certain degree of skepticism about polling, considering so many unknown variables right now. And again, I wouldn't look at the national polls. I would encourage people to watch the polls in the critical battleground states. But between now and November, I'm thinking about how much has changed just in the last 4 months. And one thing I would also, and I'm not predicting anything here, but I would say that when you have a meeting like you had between President Putin and Kim Jong-un of North Korea, as an example, it is not inconceivable that an international incident, a quote-unquote October surprise that could jolt the election, is something to, and I know the intelligence agencies, as an example, are trying to keep their eyes very, very open on this front. There's more than one way to influence an election outcome, not just with sort of cyber hacking and the like. There are other ways to do so as well, and I think we have to keep our eyes open to that possibility.
All right, we have to wrap it up here. Thank you very much, Kevin, for taking the time to speak to us. Thank you all in the audience for dialing in. We will continue with this webinar series when the election comes closer, next one in August. But for now, enjoy summer wherever you are. Take care, and we'll see you all again soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.